They told him it would be easier if he stopped remembering. Not directly, not cruelly, it was offered the way advice usually is, softened, practical, almost kind. Forgetting, they said, would help him survive. Names created pain. Faces slowed you down. If he wanted to make it through, he had to let go. It was winter when they told him this. Snow pressed against the fence in uneven drifts, collecting in corners where no one bothered to clear it. The air smelled of damp wool and smoke. He stood in line, hands numb, repeating instructions in his head the way he had learned to do when fear became dangerous. Don't ask questions. Don't look back. Don't remember too much. His name no longer mattered here, but his family's names did, because they were the first thing he was expected to surrender. This story is not about forgetting. It is about the discipline of remembering when memory becomes a liability. Before the war, his family had been ordinary in ways that only feel important after they are gone. Loud dinners, arguments about nothing, a mother who folded clothes with unnecessary precision, a father who corrected him even when he was right, a younger sister who followed him everywhere, certain that proximity was protection. Those details stayed with him when larger memories became too heavy to carry. At the camp, remembering was treated like resistance. Men whispered warnings to each other. If you keep thinking about them, you'll break. Others nodded in agreement, speaking from experience rather than certainty. Survival required narrowing the world until it fit inside the present moment. He tried. At first, he repeated the logic to himself. Forgetting was temporary. Forgetting was strategic. Forgetting did not mean betrayal, it meant delay. He told himself he would remember later, when it was safe. But later never arrived. Instead, the pressure increased. Guards, rules, time reduced to numbers and routines. Memory became dangerous not because it hurt, but because it distracted. Those who drifted into the past lost awareness of the present, and the present was unforgiving. He learned to hide his remembering. He did it quietly, without ceremony. He did not speak their names out loud. He carried them in fragments. His sister's laugh when she tried not to be heard, the smell of his father's coat in winter, the way his mother touched his shoulder when she passed behind him. Small things, portable things. At night, when exhaustion loosened his grip on control, he replayed these moments deliberately. Not all of them, just one. He chose carefully, like someone rationing food. Too much memory would undo him. Too little would make survival meaningless. This was the balance no one talked about. They told him forgetting was the price of endurance. They did not explain what remembering would cost afterward. Because long after the war ended, long after survival stopped being measured day by day, he would realize something far more unsettling. Forgetting would have been easier. But remembering was the only way his family would survive at all. And the world he returned to would ask him again to let them disappear quietly. The question he would face was not whether he could forget. It was whether he was willing to be the only one who remembered. After the war, they expected gratitude to finish the job forgetting had started. He returned thinner, quieter, carrying habits that no longer had a place. People shook his hand carefully, as if survival were fragile and might break under pressure. They asked how he was doing, then moved on before the question required an answer. The town had rehearsed this distance. It allowed him to exist without asking him to explain who no longer did. The first time he mentioned his family, the room changed. Not dramatically. Chairs did not scrape, no one argued. The conversation simply redirected itself, as if he had introduced a draft into a closed space. Someone cleared their throat. Another person spoke about reconstruction. The message was subtle and unanimous. That subject was finished. The looming shadow was practicality. "You have to think about the future now," a neighbor told him kindly. "Holding on won't bring them back." Others echoed it with different words. Forgetting was framed as maturity. Remembering was treated as refusal to adapt. He noticed how often advice sounded like concern when it was really impatience. The early fracture came at the registry office. He asked whether death records had been updated. The clerk flipped through pages, paused, then closed the book. "Some names were never confirmed," she said. "It's better not to speculate." "Better for whom?" went unanswered. He understood then that forgetting was no longer a survival tactic. It had become policy. The micro-twist arrived when he discovered how many people believed they were helping him by encouraging silence. They spoke about his resilience, about moving on, about starting fresh. None of them asked what he wanted to carry forward. Memory was treated as excess baggage, something to be discarded for efficiency. At night, he returned to his private discipline. He wrote their names on scraps of paper and hid them inside a book he kept under his mattress, not to preserve facts, but to preserve order. Each name anchored a sequence, a story. Without them, time blurred into something impersonal and endless. He limited himself to one memory per night. Any more, and he risked unraveling. Any less, and the pressure to forget began to work. He learned that remembering required structure just as survival had, rules, boundaries, control. The moral dilemma surfaced slowly. If he accepted the town's advice, he would gain ease. People would stop watching him so closely. Opportunities would open. Forgetting would be rewarded with normalcy. If he refused, he would remain marked, not as a survivor, but as someone unwilling to cooperate with peace. Peace, he realized, had conditions. The first irreversible turn came when a local official suggested gently that he remove his family's names from a public inquiry he had filed. "It's holding things up," the man said. "These cases rarely lead anywhere." Rarely was not never. He withdrew the inquiry that afternoon. Then, quietly, he began collecting testimonies elsewhere. If the town would not remember, he would build memory that did not depend on its approval. He wrote letters, traveled when he could, asked questions that did not require permission. Remembering, he understood now, was no longer private. It was an act. And acts, once begun, tended to attract consequences. The war had taught him how to survive by forgetting. Peace was now asking him to finish the lesson. He had to decide whether remembering his family was something he did for himself, or something he was willing to risk being isolated for, again.
The consequences did not arrive all at once. They accumulated. Letters went unanswered. Appointments were postponed indefinitely. When he appeared in offices where he had once been received politely, the tone shifted to procedural neutrality. No one denied him outright. They simply ensured nothing moved forward while he remained involved. The micro-twist came when he realized this was deliberate coordination. Different departments, same delays, same phrasing, same careful sympathy. Remembering his family had placed him into a category, not hostile, not dangerous, but inconvenient. A problem that could be managed by slowing time around him. He adjusted the way he remembered. Instead of speaking about his family as loss, he began speaking about them as structure, dates, addresses, occupations, ordinary facts that resisted erasure because they were verifiable. Memory, he learned, was harder to dismiss when it looked like administration. The early fracture sharpened during a public meeting about post-war housing. Names were read aloud, transfers explained, progress celebrated. He listened carefully, waiting. When the list ended without his family's address, he raised his hand. The room froze, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The official hesitated, then smiled. "That case is unresolved," he said. "We shouldn't speculate." Speculation, as if families vanished by accident. After the meeting, a man he barely knew approached him outside. "You're reopening wounds," he said quietly. "People want closure." Closure, he realized, was another word for forgetting that required cooperation. The moral dilemma deepened. If he continued, he would be accused of selfishness, of prioritizing memory over harmony. If he stopped, his family would become another gap that time would harden into absence. The town would move on with one less complication. That night, he made a small, deliberate choice. He began writing their names into a ledger of his own. Not hidden, not symbolic, organized, indexed. He treated memory like inventory, something that existed whether acknowledged or not. Each name received a page. Each page held fragments gathered from letters, testimonies, scraps of confirmation found in other towns. The act steadied him. Remembering no longer depended on permission. The looming shadow returned in a new form, warning disguised as advice. A former neighbor told him he was being talked about. She said gently, "People worry about you." Worry was the town's last acceptable pressure. He thanked her and continued. Weeks later, a response arrived from one of the letters he had sent beyond the town. A distant archive confirmed a transport record bearing his sister's name. No details, no outcome, just proof of movement. It was enough. The record transformed memory into fact, and fact changed the balance. He understood then that the town's silence was not universal. It was local. Elsewhere, remembering was possible. Elsewhere, it was already happening. The war had taught him how to survive by narrowing the world. Now, remembering required expanding it again. The next step would not be quiet. Once memory crossed borders, it stopped being a personal burden. It became something others could no longer ask him to carry alone. And he knew the town would respond when it realized remembering no longer needed its consent.
The town responded the moment it understood he had found confirmation elsewhere. It began with a visit. 2 men arrived at his door in the late afternoon, coats buttoned, expressions carefully neutral. They did not threaten, they did not accuse. One of them smiled with the practiced patience of someone delivering an inconvenient message, politely. "We've heard you're contacting archives outside the region," he said. "That can create misunderstandings." Misunderstandings was the word they used when they meant consequences. They suggested he route all requests through the municipal office for accuracy. They offered to help, to streamline, to protect him from disappointment. Every sentence was built to sound supportive while narrowing his options. The micro-twist came when he realized they were not worried about his pain. They were worried about paperwork. External confirmations created documents the town could not edit. Names that returned from outside could not be managed with the same local silence. The town could handle private grief. It could not handle records. The moral dilemma sharpened into a practical choice. If he complied and routed everything through the town, the pace would slow. Requests would be filtered. Confirmation would become optional again. If he refused, he would provoke open resistance, and the town would reclassify him from inconvenient to disruptive. That night, he performed a small, secret act. He copied the transport record by hand into his own ledger, then mailed the original confirmation to a friend in another city, someone beyond the town's influence. He did not tell anyone he had done it. He simply ensured the record could not vanish if local pressure increased.
He understood now that remembering required redundancy. You did not keep a name alive by holding it in one place. You kept it alive by refusing to let it be contained. The early fracture deepened when the municipal office sent him a written notice requesting that he cease making unverified claims in public settings. The notice mentioned community harmony, emotional well-being, the importance of rebuilding. It never mentioned his family. That absence was the point. His family's names were being treated as the source of instability. The town was offering him a familiar bargain, normality in exchange for silence. Only this time, the war was over. He refused anyway. He stopped attending town meetings, stopped asking local officials for help. He continued his search independently, quietly expanding his circle of correspondence. Each reply he received from outside felt like a breach in the wall the town had built around his memory. Then, unexpectedly, someone approached him. A woman from the bakery, older now, hands rough from years of work, caught him outside just before closing. She spoke quickly, eyes lowered. "I remember your mother," she said. He froze. "She used to buy rye bread on Fridays," the woman added, as if offering proof. "Always counted the coins twice, not because she didn't trust me, because she liked things exact." The detail hit him with painful clarity. It was so small it could not have been invented. It was real memory, surviving inside a town that claimed forgetting was necessary. The woman glanced around and lowered her voice further. "There are people who remember," she said. "They're just afraid to say it first." Then she handed him something wrapped in paper, a small bundle. Inside was a faded photograph, edges softened by handling. His mother stood in the frame, half-turned, caught mid-motion, as if someone had called her name. He held it like it might break. The war had taught him memory was dangerous. Now he understood something else. Silence was not the absence of memory. It was the price people paid to avoid speaking it. And someone had just shown him that the deal was not total. The photograph changed how he carried the rest. Until then, remembering had been defensive, something done carefully, privately, with rules designed to prevent collapse. Now it felt exposed, shared. The image proved that memory had survived outside him, lodged in someone else's hands all these years, waiting for a moment when it could be passed back. The micro-twist came with realization. The town had not erased memory completely. It had redistributed it. People carried fragments quietly, each assuming they were alone. Silence had worked, not because no one remembered, but because no one believed remembering together was possible. That understanding shifted his strategy. He stopped presenting memory as accusation. He began presenting it as recognition. When he spoke to people one-on-one, he did not ask questions that demanded answers. He offered details instead. His mother's habit of counting coins, his sister's impatience with winter coats, his father's insistence on fixing things twice. Details invited response, and responses came. A man recalled his father repairing a fence without asking payment. A woman remembered his sister dropping her school bag and crying in frustration. These were not testimonies, they were confirmations, small, human, impossible to refute without cruelty. The moral dilemma deepened again. As memory spread, so did risk. Each shared detail weakened the collective silence. People began glancing over their shoulders before speaking. Some asked him to keep their recollections private. Others asked him not to mention their names. Remembering had become contagious and dangerous. He agreed to protect them, not by stopping, but by structuring. He began recording memories without attribution, dates without sources, events without witnesses named. The ledger expanded, not into an indictment, but into an archive. The town could deny individuals. It could not deny patterns. The looming shadow returned as pressure from another direction. A notice appeared announcing a community dialogue about post-war reconciliation. His name was not mentioned, but the timing was precise. The town was attempting to reclaim control of the narrative, to channel memory into a supervised space where conclusions could be guided. He attended. The meeting was calm, carefully moderated. People spoke about healing, about looking forward, about the danger of reopening wounds. When he was invited to speak, he kept his voice steady. "I'm not asking anyone to relive anything. I'm asking that what existed be allowed to exist again." The room was silent. Someone asked whether remembering the past helped anyone still alive. Another asked whether it was fair to burden the next generation. The questions were framed as concern. They carried fear underneath. The secret act came afterward. He did not stay to argue. Instead, he left copies of his ledger, redacted, organized, factual, with two people he trusted to hold them independently. He did not instruct them. He simply ensured that memory was no longer centralized. Redundancy, he had learned, was survival. That night, he added the photograph to the ledger, sliding it carefully between pages. It did not dominate the record. It accompanied it, proof that memory had both fact and face. The town had told him to forget his family. Now he understood that remembering them was no longer only his burden. It was becoming a shared risk. And shared risks, once acknowledged, had a way of changing the rules entirely.
Once the risk became shared, the town lost its most effective weapon: isolation. It could still pressure individuals, it could still discourage conversations, but it could no longer convince everyone that they were alone in remembering. That had been the true architecture of silence, fear combined with solitude. The micro-twist arrived when the pressure shifted from him to the town itself. An external cultural office announced a small historical review project, officially unrelated, framed as community documentation. Unofficially, everyone understood what had triggered it. The town's leaders responded quickly, insisting they were fully cooperative, fully transparent, fully committed to reconciliation. The language was too perfect. He recognized it as performance, the same kind that had once made theft sound like stewardship and erasure sound like order. The moral dilemma sharpened. Cooperation could become control. If he participated fully in the official review, the town could guide the process, select which stories were acceptable, emphasize chaos, hardship, uncertainty. If he refused, the review might proceed without the fragments that mattered most, becoming another sanitized narrative that preserved comfort while claiming truth. He chose a third path again. He provided records, dates, copies, but he withheld the photograph. Not out of possession, out of protection. The photograph carried intimacy. It carried a face that could be used. Public memory often flattened people into symbols. He would not allow his mother to become a convenient image in someone else's curated story. Instead, he offered the ledger's structure, patterns that could not be softened easily. How names disappeared, how property reassigned, how language shifted from temporary to settled. Process, not spectacle. Then came the invitation he had expected. A municipal official asked to meet privately, to coordinate messaging. The phrase was clinical. Coordination meant containment.
The official praised his resilience, expressed sympathy, and suggested that certain details might inflame tensions unnecessarily. Unnecessarily. The word implied the truth was optional. The secret act came in his response. He agreed to meet, listened politely, and then asked for the town's draft statement regarding missing families. He did not challenge it verbally. He took it home, copied key phrases, and compared them to older documents he had collected. The match was unmistakable. The same template language used decades earlier to normalize transfers was now being used to normalize memory. Different era, same mechanism. Minimize specificity, diffuse responsibility, preserve stability. He understood then that the town was not simply resisting memory, it was trying to manage it into harmlessness. That night, he made a decision. He sent the photograph to the external office, not for publication, for verification, for placement in an archive beyond the town's reach. He wrote a short note with it, no drama, one sentence. "This is what the town keeps asking me to leave behind." Days later, a reply arrived confirming receipt and authenticity. The office thanked him and noted that the photograph would be preserved under protected archival conditions. The language was respectful, precise, real. He felt the weight shift. The photograph was no longer vulnerable to local silence. His mother's face now existed in a record the town could not edit. Memory had crossed the boundary from private grief into permanent evidence. The town had told him to forget his family. Now, whether it wanted to or not, the town was being forced to live beside their names again. And he knew what that would trigger next. When a system loses control of the story, it does not become honest, it becomes defensive. And defensiveness has a way of revealing truths that silence never intended to expose.
Defensiveness revealed itself first through resentment. People stopped speaking about healing and began speaking about accusations. The town's leaders insisted no one was being blamed, yet the tone changed anyway. It wasn't that they felt guilty, it was that they felt cornered. The difference mattered. He noticed it in small moments. A shopkeeper who once greeted him warmly now acted as if he were a stranger. A neighbor said, "We suffered too," with an edge that demanded equalization. Someone muttered, "Why can't you let it rest?" as he passed. Rest had become the town's preferred word for erasure. The micro-twist came from a name he did not expect to see again. A local newspaper published a short piece about the archival review. It was neutral, polite, praising the town's willingness to document its history. But in the final paragraph, it included a quote from an anonymous resident who described missing families as unverified stories and emotional interpretations. He recognized the phrasing immediately. It matched the municipal draft statement almost word for word. The town was laundering its language through anonymity. This was not just resistance, it was narrative defense, an attempt to delegitimize memory without appearing cruel. The moral dilemma sharpened. To respond publicly would escalate. He could write a letter to the editor, he could name the template, he could expose the coordination. Doing so would make him visible again as a disruptor, inviting backlash and making the archive project seem partisan. Remaining silent would allow the framing to settle, his family as interpretation, not fact. He chose precision over volume. He contacted the external office and requested that the archive publish a formal index entry, just names, dates, and sources, no accusations, no commentary. A list could not be argued with the way a story could. The external office complied. A week later, the index was released, sparse, clinical, undeniable. His family's names appeared alongside the transport confirmation and the photograph entry, referenced without drama, attached to sources beyond the town's control. The town reacted the way towns often do when confronted with facts that disrupt comfort. It went quiet, not the old quiet, the coordinated silence of forgetting, a different quiet. People read the list and avoided looking at one another. Some became defensive, others became suddenly gentle, unsure how to speak now that the deal had changed. A few approached him privately and said nothing at all, only nodding as if to acknowledge what had always been known. The long echo began. Teachers adjusted lessons, clerks modified language, community leaders spoke with new caution, choosing words that could survive documentation. The town did not become virtuous, it became aware. He understood then that this was the most realistic form of change, not confession, constraint. Once facts are recorded, behavior shifts around them. People stop relying on convenient vagueness. They become careful, not out of morality, but because the story no longer belongs exclusively to them. He walked past the square one evening and saw two teenagers reading the posted notice about the archive. One pointed at a name, the other asked a question. No one answered them, yet the question existed now in public, where it could not be privately buried. He realized then what remembering had accomplished. His family would not return, but they would no longer vanish quietly. The town had told him to forget them. Now the next generation was seeing their names as part of the landscape, unavoidable, uneditable, real. And he knew the final phase of survival was not proving the past. It was deciding what to do with a truth that finally had nowhere left to hide.